Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to continue today our little series on the psychology of St. John Paul II. This is a really important thing that we're breaking open here, and I've loved your feedback and responses. Email me, drgreg at CatholicPsych.com. People have been posting on the YouTube channel. People have been sending me messages on Instagram, on Facebook. And this is awesome. This is all I want. I want to be able to spread this beautiful, important, and world-changing truth. This is the work of St. John Paul II. And in many people's lives, the work of JPII has been transformative. And if you grew up in the quote-unquote JPII generation, then you at least know about the theology of the body. And the theology of the body is transformative. And we need to do a lot more work with spreading what the theology of the body actually is saying to us as a world and culture. But it's only the tip of the iceberg. And what I've discovered now is that the younger generations who didn't grow up with his example, his personality, his World Youth Days, his events, they don't know the goodness and the greatness, the genius and the beauty and truth of John Paul II. I've heard disparaging comments about him in general. Of course, everybody can be criticized. There's nothing wrong with saying that he's not perfect. No problem. But the sort of reputation, the whole sort of overall brand of John Paul II is not holding up for some reason. And we need it more than ever in our church and in our world. And what the church has to offer to the world, John Paul II precisely actually solved for. And in his lifetime, he helped bring down communism. This is something that we are still facing today. He brought it down in Poland. He helped the fall of the Soviet Union. And now we have to be able to see how the errors of communist ideology are still permeating so many parts of our culture. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And we're not going to get all into political science and all this kind of stuff. But I do want to talk about the psychology of John Paul II and why this is so important. So once again, I'm going to make a plea to join me in this conversation. If you are a therapist, thank you to all the therapists who have reached out. I'm especially grateful for the non-Catholic, the Protestant, Christian, other therapists who have reached out. Please let me know your thoughts on this matter. If you know a Catholic therapist, send this to them. If you have a Catholic therapist, bring this up to them. What I'm proposing here is that, and this is not to say anything critical about all the other programs that exist, the really good Catholic ones especially, this simply isn't being taught yet. And it's because it hasn't made its way into mainstream understanding of Catholic psychology. It's getting there, and certainly people are introducing this in different ways. But we gotta promote the heck out of this. We have to spread this. We have to develop this. So please join me. This is our mission here at Catholic Psych Institute. This is my personal mission. Since I was 20 years old and read Love and Responsibility, and it answered my deepest pain, and I vowed to spend the rest of my life helping marriages and families flourish through the work of St. John Paul II. This is what we're doing now. I'm almost 43 years old now, and we're still doing this, and I'm going to do this until the day I die. Please join me in this incredible work. We started this episode 180. Being Human, episode 180 is my introduction to this topic. I brought on Dr. John Crosby to talk a little bit more about the philosophy, especially with von Hildebrand, episode 182. And here we are, episode 183, continuing this conversation. So I hope this blesses you.
I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach. This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast.
All right, so I've proven sort of that at least the hypothesis is worth exploring in episode 180. We're talking about the human person, and the person is not knowable only through science. So the premise of secular psychology is only half the answer. It's only half understanding a person. So every program built on the secular psychology premise that psychology is a science alone is flawed. It's not totally wrong, it's just flawed. It's imperfect. It's missing something. What is it missing? It's missing philosophy. It's missing the understanding of the person that doesn't come through empirically validated, observable evidence, but from a rational approach that is philosophical in nature to understand philosophical principles about the person, because we are more than just the material body. We're more than just the part of the world that is subject to laws of physics and observable science. This is a basic premise. If you're a therapist, if you're a psychologist, and you have a Christian worldview, then you know the person is more than just the body. We are also spirit. And you know that the spiritual dimension of the person can't be measured. So we have to start off with agreement that there's more to the person than just what comes through the science. We can't contradict the science, but we can add to the science. In fact, we can undergird the science. We can create a foundation of understanding the person and then have something to measure the science by. And we will be able to get ahead of anything that comes from science alone, because science is limited in what it can actually prove about anything, and especially the person, which we already know as a premise is more than what is materially observable. Okay, so we've justified this approach. We need the philosophy. So then it's what philosophy? And we can skip ahead to the conclusion here that the philosophy of John Paul II is the most effective approach to a contemporary understanding of the human person. It is grounded on, it is built upon the tremendous philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and then it utilizes a framework and an approach that comes from the 20th century of phenomenology, and it asks questions that modern man is asking. This is the whole nutshell. Why do we need John Paul II? It's because he is providing the philosophical understanding of the person that combines the foundation of Thomistic philosophy with the contemporary approaches that men and women of today take. We ask about the experience. We ask about what's going on the inner life, the inner subjectivity. What does it feel like? What is my truth, quote unquote? This is the question of today. That's why Thomas Aquinas alone is not enough to convert most people, most kids today, most of the culture today. They don't want to know what's the top-down, rational, logical explanation that I can forget about what I feel, forget about what I experience, forget about what this means to me. I'm going to just enter into this real abstract world of moral truth and all of these objective things. That's just not where people are today. There was a time in history when that was really effective. But today, which started in the 20th century, or didn't start, but really took hold in the 20th century, is when people started really digging into, well, you know, that truth, I get it, I hear you, that sounds wonderful. It doesn't really match up with what I'm experiencing inside. Now, a Catholic perspective, a Catholic answer to that would be, well, there's probably something wrong with what's going on inside then, of course. But that's not a good enough answer. So then what John Paul II did was to say, we have to give a better answer. We have to talk about why is the inner experience not lining up with the objective truth. How do we understand the inner experience? Where does the inner experience come from? What is it made up of? How does it form? And how does it go in all of these directions where something that is morally, objectively true, good, and beautiful doesn't feel true, good, and beautiful on the inside for many people at different parts of their life and their own human development? These are really important questions. And so we have to look to St. John Paul II because he answered these questions. I'm going to keep saying this over and over and over again, and eventually enough people are going to listen that we start to do something about this. John Paul II answered these questions. And I want to show you this book. This is, if you're watching me on YouTube, you can see this right now or on video. This is the Person and Act. Person and Act. This is the work of St. John Paul II. This is a very dense, you can see if you're looking at it right now, this is like a 2-inch thick book. This is a door stopper of a brick of a book. Now, this version in particular is recently published, and it's a new edition that's been translated appropriately. This is beyond the scope of our podcast today, but there's a long history of mistranslating John Paul II. He wrote and taught originally. He's from Poland. His Polish is his native tongue. He was teaching originally at a Polish university, and a lot of his original thought was expressed in Polish, and then, obviously translated throughout the years. But because it's so philosophically dense, and because it is a sort of unique marrying together of two philosophical systems, there's a lot of room for people from the sort of Thomistic camp to look at everything through their lens, people from the phenomenological camp to look at everything through their lens, and there's this weird battle within a lot of these higher level philosophical circles. And they, everybody wants to sort of prove their own school, their own theory. And so they look at John Paul II and they say, well, what he really meant was, and then they explain a certain thing that is very difficult to understand in his own words through their lens and maybe discolor a bit what is the deeper meaning. So we've had decades now of this. And there are Polish speakers and Polish philosophers who understand the original language and have really gone deep to understand John Paul II's thought. And now they're rewriting his original works in English for the rest of us to benefit from. This is where it starts. Now, this 2-inch thick brick doorstopper of a volume is one of, I believe, 20 volumes that is going to be published from Catholic University of America, the CUA Press, in collaboration with the Knights of Columbus and various editors and various translations. And this is a long-term project here. This first volume has come out. The second volume, which I have over my shoulder over there, is out, which is further lectures. And we've got 18 more to look forward to. Probably the next 20 years of material to break open here. And this is only scratching the surface. We're at the tip of the iceberg of what needs to happen and what will happen and what is happening. Because this is the answer. And what John Paul II does in this book, first and foremost, is, as the 20-volume series that we can look at, is breaks open the blueprint of the human person. And this is the foundation that I believe he was lecturing and developing these ideas in university in Poland, at the Lublin University, and this is going back to the 50s. 1940s and 50s, he was developing these ideas, and this is the foundation of the psychology of St. John Paul II. And it's all there. This is the blueprint. And then we see it in his poetry. We see it in his dramas, his plays. He's got beautiful plays. My dream is to build a theater that we can just put on the plays of John Paul II with workshops that teach the deeper blueprint of the human person and then show it in beauty and art form. And we see the jeweler shop talking about love and marriage and relationship and the dynamics between man and woman. And we have our God's brother talking about vocation and transformation and how you become who you are and what this life is really all about. And we have everything from Job and Jeremiah and on and on and on. And well, there's not that many plays, but the plays and the poetry and the writings and his letters. And then we get into his time as Pope, and we have the documents of Vatican II that he was instrumental, the explanation of Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, and the working out of things. And then we see like Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes, another church document, number 22. Christ reveals man to himself. Okay, what does it mean to be human? This is why it's the Being Human podcast. What does it mean that we're searching, we're seeking, we're looking for reasons why things are going wrong? How do we get things to go right? What can we do about it? What can't we do about it? What's the difference between spiritually based anxiety that will decrease when we trust God more and physiologically, biologically based anxiety that won't decrease no matter how much you trust in God and maybe needs medication? These are really good questions. We've got really bad answers coming from a secular world or a disintegrated, over-spiritualized religious world. In both directions, we're getting bad answers because we don't know what it means to be human. So we have to go back to the blueprint. What is it to be human? John Paul II has already told us. He's written it up. He's given us all the indications that he's giving us the answer. It's in Gaudium et Spes. Christ reveals man to himself. Okay, well, that's interesting, JP2. What does he reveal? What are you saying? Now, does that mean we only have by faith? Do we have the blueprint given to us in the gospel? No, it's not the full blueprint given in the gospel. But there's a foundation for the blueprint. In JP2's approach, his philosophical approach is itself a transformation of the way we approach understanding our humanity. Because he said, well, philosophically, we have to understand this. We have to have philosophical arguments, logical, rational, not dependent on revelation. That's a pure philosophy. But then, it's like, well, should philosophical truth be somehow incongruent with revealed theological truth that we have by faith? Jesus comes to reveal the kingdom of God. We know we're made for a place that's not here. Is that philosophically provable? No, it's not philosophically provable, but it is revealed to us. It's true about the person. So should what's philosophically provable be incongruent with what is revealed to us by faith? Definitely not. And then, hey, let's throw in a third category while we're at it. Should what is scientifically observable be incongruent with what is revealed by faith? Absolutely not. So we have the science, we have the philosophy, and we have the faith. We have our spiritual life, our revealed truth. So John Paul II knows this when he writes, Christ reveals man to himself. Okay, but that's not enough. So his entire philosophical framework is open to and looking at spirituality and faith. And, it's like you're in the philosophical house and you're looking across the street at your neighbor in the theological house. And you're like, I see you over there. I'm looking at you. And he knows what's true about the person over there has got to be true about the person over here, even though we're going to employ different methodology to get to a different facet of understanding. Same thing with the science house. All three houses. We've got three fields, three manners of expertise, three facets to look at the same common denominator, the same object that all three are looking at, the human person. So if you are a therapist, if you are one who is charged with helping a human person become a better human person, you have to know what all three houses say about the human person if you want to be good at your job. That's what I'm proposing. And that is a Catholic psychology. And John Paul II gives us the blueprint for this. So I want to give you an example. If you don't believe me, it's okay. If you don't know me enough, if you don't trust me, even my own colleagues, we're all so good. And I'm the same way. And holding a little suspicion, being a little cynical, being a little bit, okay, let's see, you have to prove yourself, right? Who am I? Who am I to just say this and make these bold claims without backing it up? I don't deserve any kind of blind faith. So let's break it open. Now, we're in a podcast. This is not for the philosophically elite, but I want to give you an example. Because people say, like, well, what does this mean? John Paul II, okay, theology of the body, I get it. What are you talking about? Blueprint of the human person. What does that even mean? John Paul II was the most important psychologist of the last 200 years. More important than Freud, more important than Rogers, more important than Jung, more important than Maslow, more important than Viktor Frankl, more important than Bessel van der Kolk, more important than Gabor Mate, more important than Brené Brown, more important than Jordan Peterson, more important than literally any other psychologist of the last 200 years. And now that's a bold claim. Okay, so we want psychologies. Number one, okay, if you're going to write a psychology, if you're going to have a model of psychology, you need to be talking about the brain, okay, the body, our emotions, okay? We have to be talking about the faculties of the human person, the will. We have to be talking about where all these things are operating together. What does it mean to think a thing, to feel a thing, to choose a thing? Okay, all of that. Okay, and then anybody who is philosophically inclined, especially from a Catholic perspective, you say, like, well, that sounds really Thomistic. Aren't you just saying, why isn't Thomas Aquinas the most important psychologist? Well, let's broaden our time scope, our time frame to the last 1,000 years. Well, I would say that he's a really important psychologist if we go that far back. But what does man of today ask? What is the contemporary human? The psychologies, Freud brings in something really important. He brings in the idea of the unconscious. Okay, this is a new term that is now presented to the 20th century. The unconscious. What is that? That's not in Aquinas. And it's not something that the church had any framework to really answer those questions. And we talk about the truth of each person and the subjectivity and the experience and what it means to have this subjective inner truth, inner sense of the I, inner sense of the self, and then all of these sort of like external, objective, other kinds of parts of the self. How do we operate in community? What does it mean to be in society? And then what does it mean to have these like rational principles? 2 + 2 = 4. How is that? What does that have to do with how I feel? What does that have to do with my truth? Man is a man and woman is a woman. What does that have to do with my truth? Right? You think that's an absurd conclusion to come to where we can even question that? It's not absurd. It actually makes perfect sense given the last 150 years of the kinds of questions that people ask and the way that they are being asked. So the unconscious and consciousness itself and a whole different realm in between of the subconscious, These are new terms. These are not Thomistic terms. These are not things that could be understood through the tradition of philosophical Catholic understanding of the person. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. And there's nothing wrong with the philosophical tradition of the church. The problem is people change and the questions are changing. And as the questions evolve, it is the teaching of the church that the answers the church provides has to follow the questions people are asking. And so the church has to also grow along with culture in the way it explains and understands the traditional teachings of the church. And now in the 20th century, we were awakened to an entirely different way of asking these questions, which starts with the inner experience of the person, the phenomenon of what it means to have an experience, to be in this world. That's where phenomenology comes from. That's why John Paul II was so brilliant in taking that Thomistic foundation and applying it in a phenomenological way to answer the questions people are asking. And he did that by building a full framework of the human person, psychologically astute, that includes both the grounding in that revealed truth, the grounding in that philosophical truth, the grounding in the integrated truth that is open to scientific observation, along with how to talk in a way that answers the questions of contemporary man. So if you're going to have a model for psychology, you have to absolutely be completely centered on the work of St. John Paul II. Your model of psychology has to have the consciousness of a person, subconsciousness of a person, and the unconscious world of a person front and center in your understanding and explanation of what it is to be human, because that is what is going to help the field of psychology in a Catholic way answer the problems of the contemporary society. Okay, so Dr. Greg, does John Paul II do that? How does he offer an explanation of the unconscious and the subconscious and consciousness? In this book, he answers the question. This is the blueprint of the human person. And he answers all these questions from the 50s. And we need to build schools around this and training programs around this and certifications around this. And we've built a certification around this. But we need to go bigger than that. We have to build, if there's going to be master's programs, doctoral programs, we have to build institutes around this. We have to build centers so that we can get funding. These have to be departments that are contributing to the Vatican, to the USCCB. This is what we need to do to understand the human person. This is what Catholic charities should be grounded on. This has got to take over our Catholic culture. We can do something about it. You have to share this episode. We have to get this out. Okay, let me give you a little taste. Here's a little taste. John Paul II talks about consciousness. He's got chapters on consciousness and how it fits in the blueprint of the human person, between the interplay that comes from the body and between that and the spirit. And he talks about the spiritual dimension of man. We are made for objective truth. We are made for understanding transcendent things like objective truth, goodness, and beauty. What is beauty with a capital B? You know, it's like, you know it. If you're in front of something beautiful and if you have had the experience subjectively, internally, of what it's like, what is your beautiful space? What is your happy place in your mind? Is it at the ocean? Is it in the mountains? Are we're planning a trip down to the Grand Canyon and going out west this summer. I can't wait. I've got this idea in my mind built up of being at the Grand Canyon and watching a sunset over the Grand Canyon, and the magnitude of majesty and beauty and glory. Capital letters, B for beauty, G for glory, M for magnitude. These are things that are transcendent. They are beyond me, but they tug at me internally so that I'm part of the experience. I'm not just rationally writing out a logical argument for what beauty is. I'm in it And there's both things happening at the same time. This is what John Paul II teaches, how and why this happens. If you're standing at that moment in the Grand Canyon, looking at the sunset, and caught up out of yourself, an ecstatic moment, which means to come out of yourself. It's ecstasy. What does that mean? You're having a phenomenological experience of something subjectively that lines up with something objectively that's outside of you. Multiple people are going to be attuned to that, be able to go out of themselves to experience that. And if it's not that in particular for you, the idea is universal and objective, that anybody can imagine a place where they are caught up in that kind of beauty. That's transcendent. So how do we make sense of the inner experience matching up with the outer experience? And then also, how do we make sense of people who are, let's say, depressed? Let's say that there's a weight on their system. There's a heaviness in their inner experience. And that you can imagine being at the Grand Canyon. Somebody could be at the Grand Canyon and see this glorious, majestic experience and not experience it. What does that mean? Does that mean it's not objectively beautiful because their truth, quote unquote, is all that matters? Well, for me, that's not beauty, but for you, it's beauty. So you could say for you, there's beauty, but it's not really objectively beautiful. Or is this our criteria? Do we look through that lens and say, well, because we know there's objective truth and that this is objectively beautiful, that there's some form of subjective distortion or disorder happening in this person? That's what we would say. That's how we can talk about it. John Paul II lined up that whole process. He gave us a blueprint to understand psychologically what we can discern, diagnose, how we can understand the person and the trajectory they're on. And in that case, we could say, well, this person is so blunted in their affect that they have such a minimal view of such a narrow spectrum of where they feel beauty, that the goal for this person that we can find a path towards is that they will expand their inner experience and get to the place, because it's part of the human blueprint that the subjective experience can match an objective truth about the person, about the world, about beauty, about all sorts of things. And again, don't get stuck on the details. Some people maybe are not going to be moved by the mountains immediately. And so, because there's different varying degrees of subjective experience, but you will have a place that you can imagine where you could be. And maybe it's not visual. Maybe it's auditory. Maybe it's being at the symphony. Maybe it's being immersed in the sound of human innovation and creativity through musical instruments. And there's a symphony of movement that strikes the core of your being. And it could be art, it could be in various forms, but these are all different manifestations of beauty. Okay, so there's objectively, there is beauty, and then there's subjectively your ability to respond to it. So this has to do with consciousness. This has to do with what's going on unconsciously for a person, and then how it becomes a part of their story, and how it becomes experienced, and how it lines up with, or doesn't line up with, what is objectively true. All right, so let me just give you an example. And now, the example is going to serve two purposes. On the first hand, it's going to serve the purpose of proving the fact that what I'm saying is true. There is evidence in the work of John Paul II to show how he's actually building out an entire blueprint of the human person. The second purpose of reading this is I'm going to just give you a few sentences because you need to understand why this hasn't happened yet. And his sentences are confusing, are really sort of nebulous and abstract, and it almost sounds like you have to have a secret language decoder to really, and you really do have to read all of this to get to the point where you understand the blueprint that he's sharing. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying every person should be able to actually make sense of this on their own. But if you're familiar with theology of the body, you get that. Like, theology of the body itself is really hard to read. And it means that you have to read it multiple times in prayer, with deep reflection, finding other sources, listening to different commentaries. This is the wonderful gift that Christopher West and others have provided. They summarize and share and spread the goodness and beauty. Jason Everett is one of the best summarizers and regurgitators, taking in and chewing and reflecting on and presenting a wonderfully concise and summarized vision of what is being said in the theology of the body. This is really important. We need the same thing to happen now in the philosophy, which is why I'm spending the rest of my life doing this. And why bringing together, there are many other experts doing this. But there are not many other psychologists yet doing this. And that's why I'm begging, reaching out, proposing, offering open doors of collaboration to anybody in our field, that this is where we need to go with this. Okay, so the second purpose of reading this is also to say this is pretty complex. So this is a third point in one subsection of a whole chapter of consciousness and what he says is the analysis of efficacy. So how we are efficient. And what does he mean? How do we put into action behaviors and actions that are effective because we are the agent of our efficient cause? All right, just describing it already, you're like, what the heck are you talking about? These are very deeply philosophical terms. So to have an efficient cause means that it's the thing that gets the ball rolling. If I push a ball across the driveway, if I throw a ball to my kid playing out in the backyard, I'm the efficient cause of the movement of that ball because I'm the one propelling it. Well, John Paul II says that we are the efficient cause of our own actions and that we are agents of action. And that, so he's battling against this idea that we have no free will. This is another way to talk about self-determination or free will. How are we actually not just a culmination of neurological, synaptic, chemical interactions? How are we not just evolutionary products? And we just think and feel and act the way we do because of evolution, the survival instinct, or survival of the fittest. Okay, that's why this is a philosophical response to that. And yet, at the same time, we are still grounded in a world that is neurological, that does make sense in a material way. So it's both. We're not pure spirit. We're not just pure will. We are also connected to, beholden to, and in many ways subject to the laws of physics and nature. So the world of this interaction is most prominent in consciousness. That's this dimension of human psychology where the interplay between these two worlds is most clear. We have to be experts of consciousness. If you are learning how to be a psychologist, a therapist, and you are going to do it in a Catholic way, you have to be focused on the philosophical understanding of consciousness and the way that overlaps and interplays with the philosophy of science and all of the scientific, psychological evidence and data that we are getting. If we don't have that, we are fundamentally flawed in missing the most important part of our understanding of the human person in the 21st century. Okay, so he's talking about efficiency and what it means to be an efficient cause, that we are self-determining, we have free will. And he's saying, okay, also that overlaps consciousness. So he's got this whole chapter on consciousness and efficiency. And so he's giving all these subpoints. And he talks about how there's this movement of content, that what we learn, what we experience, our memory is then pushed into parts of our inner worlds that we are not consciously aware of. And he talks about the subconscious. He says the subconscious attests to the dynamism and potentiality of man. The subconscious attests to the dynamism and potentiality of man. So in other words, he has this whole big argument. This is so deeply psychological. And it's funny when you hear a theologian, brilliant theologians and philosophers, teach John Paul II. If you go to the JPII Institute, if you go to courses at Catholic University, and so many other places, Christopher West, if you go to Theology of the Body Institute and you learn from him, you listen to these teachers and you're like, this is so psychological. If you're in that class, stuff gets drummed up inside of you. And it's like this has to do with my healing. This has to do with my mom. This has to do with my dad. Like, why is this philosophy class triggering emotion that has to do with my marriage or my children? Or it's like, this is so psychological. Why are we not teaching this in psychology classes that are Catholic? Let's do it. He says the interior space. He says, what is understood by the subconscious is, in a sense, the interior space into which some content is pushed or in which it is detained before the threshold of consciousness. So he's painting a picture in his blueprint that we have a world of the subconscious, which is this threshold of consciousness. And in our conscious light, it's when we see, we know, we understand, this is what's happening in my conscious mind. And he explains all of that, what that means, what that is. That's part of the model that he built. That's part of his blueprint. And then he says there's a threshold, a sort of floor at the bottom of this room of consciousness. And then under that floor, there's a basement. And in that basement, we can call that the subconscious. And that's a space in which content from our conscious world, from our daily present moment life, all through our whole lifespan, content is pushed into the basement and detained under that floor. And he makes another point, and he says that there's a movement, a dynamism, he calls it, that the content in the subconscious, in the basement, has its inner movement like it wants to be expressed. There's this inner movement that any chance, he says, when the person is in what he eventually describes as defense mechanisms, so we have all these active conscious reasons why we keep stuff in the basement. And then, but we notice that when those defenses are weakened or limited, either by sickness or even in sleep, we notice that content from the basement seeps up. It crosses the threshold into our conscious awareness of our mind. And so if we're really tired, if we're really hungry, the things from inside of us start to come out. Now, this is also amazingly consistent with something I've talked about in a lot of other places with parts theory. And I use this example that if you're hangry, if you're feeling hangry and you need a Snickers bar, you know, it's like that Danny DeVito ad when you see this grumpy, short little troll of a, part of us that is like kind of angry and grumpy. And then you have the Snickers bar and then you become like, oh, now that's my real self. Well, wait, it's not your real self when you're hangry. It's a part that's been in the basement. But then when this is John Paul II has already explained how this happens. Way before parts theory, way before hangry was a term, way before the Snickers ad, he was saying that when we're limited by sickness, by limits of our humanity, like even hunger, things from our basement seep through the threshold into our consciousness, and we might even act out of parts like that, and act in ways that we don't even know where that came from. Is this not mind-blowing that he's already written this? He's already fleshed out this blueprint. He's already described one of the most important pieces of pretty much every therapy case I've ever worked on. Why isn't this being taught? We need to do this. We can do this. Join me in doing this. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing this till the day I die. Join me. We have so many layers here that he's already fleshed out. He talks about the vegetative part of the person, so the operations of biology, and that includes hunger, it includes thirst, it includes desires, needs that are being worked out on a biological level. Even he talks about the sexual drive, the sexual urge, our sexual proclivity, these biological drives and needs that come up at different times. He makes sense of all of it. How does that relate with the content that comes from our conscious mind, which is perceived through this lens of interpretation, of narrative, of meaning, of the ways that we can be in touch with transcendent truth. So we become aware of what's good, what is moral, what is effective, what is reasonable for society. How does that play into these biological instincts and urges and desires and drives that I have coming up from inside of me? And then where does that play out in consciousness? He's writing all about it. It's all here. It's in this book, which has been around for decades, only recently appropriately translated. Another section, the subconscious indicates consciousness as the sphere of the human person's proper realization. Okay, so now he's talking about freedom. Consciousness is the proper sphere for realization of becoming who we really are. That means we are not properly human when we are only reacting unconsciously to the things that are in that basement of subconsciousness. He says that in order to be properly human, to be properly self-actualized, self-realized, he was using these terms before Carl Rogers. And whatever Carl Rogers did to hijack these terms, self-actualization, it's an evil term in some spheres. And it should be, because Carl Rogers, helped religious self-actualize to realize that they should, forget their vows and move out of their religious life and start living promiscuity and different lives of whatever they really, quote-unquote, want. Okay, that's a hijacking of a good term. That's not what John Paul II means by self-actualization, self-realization. He means the proper understanding of become who you are. Realize the full potential of who God made you to be as the saint version of yourself. And the place for that to happen properly is in your conscious mind, your conscious awareness, that you can be aware of what is motivating you. Okay, so if you're just acting hangry without any self-awareness, you're not being realized. You're not being a saint. You're also not culpable for these things in the same way, because it's not coming out of your human freedom. We talk about that with addictions. If you're just acting out of an addiction unconsciously, drinking, you're not making free human conscious choices. Your freedom is limited by addiction. So he's saying here that the proper sphere for realization, human actualization, is in your conscious mind. So then he has before I get to that, so just to add to this another, he says, third, in its continuous relation with consciousness, the subconscious shows us man as a being that is subject to time from within, a being that has its own interior history. I could spend the next 5 years unpacking this sentence. We need to. If you've not caught the desperation in my voice and then the deep impact of this, what does this mean? We approach each other as if we are all in the same timeline, as if history is unfolding 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day at a time. And we hold each other to the standard of objective criteria. We're all subject to the same timeline. That's how we operate. That's how we act. And yet, interiorly, do you not experience the variability of time? Do you not experience interiorly this very confusing, surprising, astonishing difference between time flies when you're having fun or a watched pot will never boil. These two phrases that give color to and mark a significant dimension of our human experience. The interiority of time and the way we experience it is not objective, and it is not generalizable to everybody else's experience. So what is he saying here? This is really interesting. The subconscious shows us man as a being that is subject to time from within, a being that has its own interior history. The subconscious allows us to better understand how the stream is connected with the potentiality of the subject. The stream of time, the way we understand time, the way we experience time, it is connected with the potentiality of the subject. Now remember, potentiality is that so much of us is locked up in our unconscious. The actuality is there's potential and then there's actual. So it's like, if I'm ready to throw the baseball to my son, I'm potentially throwing the baseball. When I actually throw it, it's put into motion. This is the actuality of that action. Philosophical terminology here, trying to break it down. The potentiality of the person is in the subconscious, and the actuality, the actual realization of the person is in consciousness. And we can see here that the stream of time interiorly experienced is connected with the potentiality of the subject. It thus indirectly shows us where to seek the springs of the human individual's history. Every person has their own history. Every person is building an identity of self from the material building blocks, the immaterial building blocks of the things held within our subconscious. And it gives color to the way we experience time. Time flies when you're having fun. Okay, well, what is fun? What's fun for you is different than what's fun for me. We have individual, unique histories. We have individual, unique ways that our past has become ingrained within our unconscious. Some of my best memories, some of my favorite moments in my teenage years, in my childhood, were on a sailboat. I love sailing. If I close my eyes and I start to sort of fantasize about sailing, being on a sailboat, in a small boat, like just coasting over the water, hearing the wind, the flapping, the lapping of waves against the hull of the boat, the raw power of the wind captured in my hand through the main sheet holding a sail, all of these moments bring me out of myself. And time could stand still for me. Now other people are like, that sounds horrible. That's the last place I want to be. I want nothing to do with anything you just described. And if you were to be in that moment, it will be grueling, and you'll be like, when is this going to end? I can't wait for this day to be over. I can't wait for this hour to be over. And maybe you get sick on the boat. Maybe you're feeling like it's too much work. Maybe it's the last thing that you want to do to enjoy yourself. So time flies when we're having fun is true subjectively. How that John Paul II is making sense of this. What's more psychological than this? This pressing toward consciousness. Oh, this is a fourth point he's making. The subconscious distinctly delineates the hierarchy of man's potentiality. This pressing toward consciousness, this striving to become conscious, to have conscious lived experience that constantly emanates from the subconscious is very remarkable. Now, if John Paul II says anything is very remarkable, we should all stop and pause. Because this is like a giant red flag that John Paul II is planting in the middle of his own writing to say, everybody, stop and look. Let's take a look at this together. If you're on a hike and then the trail guide says, wait a minute, I just saw something here in the trail. Look at this. Let's look at this stone on the path. And at first glance, you're like, okay, this is just, we've been looking at 1 billion stones on this hike, and I'm like jaded at how many stones are on this path. And then the trail guide says, let's stop and look right here. Everybody come around. Look what's here. And he's saying that there's a drive, a dynamic, a movement that is a pressing towards consciousness of things that are in our unconscious. And when that threshold is weakened, stuff comes up. And that shows something really remarkable about the person. And he ties it into freedom and how we can become saints, how you become the best version of yourself, how you can become who you are. And then he says his last and final point here that I'm going to make for today. Let us add, and I think this is when I read this 14 years ago. And when I read this, I realized not only do I want to spend the rest of my life making love and responsibility a manual for marriage and family therapy, I realized that John Paul II has written the blueprint of anything and everything we need to know about the human person, especially for anybody who is going to profess themselves an expert in accompaniment and anything to do with therapy or mental health. He says, let us add that bringing into consciousness the content suppressed in the subconscious, and especially thoroughly objectifying this content, is one of the important tasks of education and morality. Now, it's hard to say that this is a mic drop moment, because mic drop usually it usually has the connotation of like everybody in the room knows what was just said and is there's nothing else to say. Unfortunately, we're not in a room where everybody in the room knows what was just said. And this is not a criticism of anybody listening or anybody who doesn't know what was just said. This is a description. This is just to say that John Paul II was on such another level that it's almost like he can't really have mic drop moments. Now, you could argue that, and I'm sure there are moments as Pope, World Youth Day, statements from documents. He obviously has mic drop moments. But it's never really everything that we think it is at first glance, what he says. Even Christ reveals man to himself. Like, okay, we can say now that's a mic drop moment, but we're still talking about it. Decades later, still unpacking that and still promoting that and trying to get people to realize what a mic drop moment that was. If you know, you know. But many people understandably don't know. Let us add that bringing into consciousness the content suppressed in the subconscious, and especially through objectivizing this content, is one of the important tasks of education and morality. Those are gigantic topics and fields and considerations. The entire project of morality, the entire project of education. And he does not use that word lightly. He doesn't mean Department of Education or, the way that a school system builds a curriculum. He calls the family the school of love. He uses words in really, really big ways. As big as possible. So think about the largest, grandest, most wide understanding of the concept of education that you can imagine. To bring out, to call into being, to be this process of becoming, of conversion, of transformation, of moving towards, of becoming who you are. It doesn't mean just learn your math or history. It means everything that's informing you about who to become, how you're called to become. And then the entire field and scope of morality. Everything about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, how to act and be good, how to act and become bad. All of that is in the scope of morality, capital M. Bringing into consciousness the content suppressed in the subconscious is one of the important tasks of education and morality. Isn't this task of bringing into the world of consciousness those things that are suppressed in our subconscious, isn't that the task of a therapist? Isn't that the task of a psychologist? What is John Paul II saying here? He's saying that psychology is of prime importance for our church and world today. He's saying that understanding this process, understanding the subconscious, understanding our consciousness is of prime importance for all education and morality. How much more so then is it of prime importance that we understand his lens if you're specifically in the field of bringing things from the subconscious to consciousness? I cannot overstate this. Okay, and then what is this other line here? Thoroughly objectivizing this content. That means simply that we are bringing it out of our unconscious and then we are looking at it and talking about it and realizing that this is part of myself. This is another fine-tuned distinction, very philosophical, very difficult to unpack, but there's a difference between self-knowledge and self-awareness. So we can have the inner experience of being self. It's like, I know that I'm the one who's acting, I'm feeling, I'm thinking, and I don't have to have a second layer of reflection. In psychology, we would call it metacognition. And then there is self-knowledge, where we have knowledge about the self. We have a realization that this is what's happening. We spend time in the present moment considering, reflecting on who I am, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, what are my motivations. It's the moment that you go from acting hangry to realizing with self-knowledge, I haven't eaten all day. My feelings, my mood, my words, my irritation is potentially coming from a lack of nutrition. Oh, now I see. Now I get it. You just moved content from subconscious to consciousness and then thoroughly objectivized it. And now guess what you can do? You can make a better choice. You can act with virtue. You can become who God called you to become. You can become self-realized. This is why we need this work. This is how we become saints. This is how we do the right thing and act well. The ramifications of this are so far-reaching and so deep. Whether you're a therapist working with somebody in a difficult marriage and you're trying to uncover why is so much being triggered in this moment, if somebody is having an affair, if somebody cheated, if somebody's dealing with the trauma of somebody else cheating, if somebody is dealing with parenting their children, they're realizing that their wounds from their own childhood are now becoming transferred to their kids. How do we open that up? How do we explore that? How do you know you're unconscious? How do you bring it into the light of conscious awareness? How do you thoroughly objectivize it so you can have self-knowledge, not just self-awareness? And then what do you unlock and open up with freedom to make better choices for yourself in your life? Are you discerning a vocation? Are you thinking about a job, a change of job, how you're acting in your job, how you respond to your boss who's giving you negative feedback, no feedback, positive feedback? How do you respond to your colleague who's giving you a hard time, who's having an affair? Literally all issues. Every moment of your humanity is affected by this teaching, this understanding of the human person that St. John Paul II, the greatest psychologist of the last 200 years, has already written about and fleshed out for us in this book, especially what we're talking about today, Person in Act, to be deciphered, unpacked, translated, and disseminated to the world. Please join me. This is not a light request. And this is not superfluous. This is not just another thing that's kind of important amongst all of the things that are important. This is the thing that will affect every other thing that's important. This is our lead domino. Once we knock this over, it knocks over every other domino. Educational problems, family problems, gender ideology problems, literally every problem. Church problems, funding problems, committee problems, meetings problems, like on and on we can go. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We're just getting started. Please join me. Please share this with anybody who has ears to hear this. Please send me your questions. Send me your comments. I want to go deep with this. We're going deep with this. Join us. God bless you.
Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe, as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.